She walked back into the house that night, expecting routine, maybe silence, maybe questions, maybe forgiveness. But what she found was something far worse. Nothing was broken, nothing was stolen, yet everything was gone. No arguments, no accusations, no goodbye, just empty spaces where a life once existed. Some people shout when they're hurt. Others beg some fight, but the most dangerous kind of pain is the one that leaves quietly. Because when someone removes every trace of themselves, they're not asking for closure, they're delivering a lesson. This isn't a story about anger, this is a story about self-respect. About the moment someone realizes they deserve peace more than explanations, and sometimes the loudest. Revenge is silence. She came back later than usual. The sound of her keys softer than normal, as if the house itself demanded silence. She expected the familiar weight of routine to greet her. The unspoken tension that had become normal between them. Maybe a question hanging in the air. Maybe his presence on the couch, pretending not to care. What she did not expect was the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong the moment she stepped inside. The air felt different. Lighter. Almost empty. Like a place that had already begun to forget the people who once lived in it. She took a few steps forward, heels echoing slightly, and that echo unsettled her more than any argument ever had. It was too clear, too sharp, as if nothing was there to absorb the sound. She looked around instinctively, her eyes searching for proof that life was still intact. The lights were on, the furniture was in its place, the walls still held their color, but something essential was missing. His jacket was no longer hanging by the door. The shoes that were always kicked off carelessly near the entrance were gone. The small irritations she used to complain about had disappeared, and only then did she realize how much space they had filled. She called his name once, softly, without urgency, expecting an answer out of habit rather than hope. The silence that answered her was complete and unforgiving. As she moved deeper into the house, the realization began to form slowly, like a truth that refused to be rushed. The coffee table was clean. Too clean. The remote was neatly placed. The small chaos that made the place feel lived in had been erased. It was as if someone had carefully edited him out of the scene, leaving behind a version of reality that looked familiar, but felt entirely wrong. She walked into the bedroom and stopped at the doorway. The closet door was open, and one side was empty. Not messy, not half done, but intentionally cleared. Hangers lined up with nothing on them. A quiet confession of what had happened. Her mind raced back to the dinner. The casual conversation, the way she had laughed without thinking, the way she had checked her phone and seen no messages from him. At the time, it felt harmless, almost insignificant. She had told herself there would be time to explain later, time to smooth things over. Standing there now, surrounded by absence, she realized how naive that thought had been. This wasn't a reaction born of jealousy or rage. This was something colder, something far more deliberate. She walked through the house as if retracing memories, touching surfaces where his hands had been, noticing the absence of the smallest details. The framed photo on the shelf was gone, leaving behind a lighter rectangle on the wall where it had hung for years. The spare toothbrush in the bathroom cup was missing. Even the scent that used to linger, the one she never noticed until it was gone, had vanished. It felt like he hadn't just left the house, but had removed himself from her life with surgical precision. There was no note on the counter, no dramatic message waiting to be read. That, more than anything, unsettled her. She had prepared herself for anger, for accusations, for harsh words that she could argue against or dismiss. But there was nothing to fight. The silence gave her no defense, no role to play. It simply stated a fact she couldn't undo. He had chosen to leave without giving her the comfort of confrontation. As she sat down, the weight of it all began to sink in. This wasn't an impulsive decision. Every empty space told a story of planning, of time taken to think, to accept, to let go. He hadn't wanted to be caught in a scene. He hadn't wanted to plead or explain himself. He had decided that his peace mattered more than being understood. That realization hurt more than any argument ever could. She remembered how he used to sit quietly during disagreements. How she mistook his silence for weakness, for indifference. She had never considered that silence could be a form of strength, that some people process pain inwardly until a line is crossed and there is no need for words anymore. The dinner that night hadn't been the sole reason for his departure. It was simply the moment that confirmed everything he had already been feeling. The house, once a shared space filled with compromises and unspoken expectations, now felt like a mirror reflecting her choices back at her. Every missing item forced her to confront the truth she had avoided. She had assumed he would always be there, that his patience was endless, that his love was quiet because it was secure. She never imagined that quiet love could also leave quietly, without warning. Time passed strangely as she sat there, unsure of what to do next. There was no one to call, no explanation to demand. Even if she reached out now, what would she say? The absence had already said everything for him. He hadn't left to teach her a lesson in anger. He had left because staying would have meant betraying himself. In that moment she understood the cruelty of an unrecognizable reality. The house was the same, but her place in his life was not. The routine she took for granted had ended without ceremony, and as she sat in the stillness, surrounded by the traces of a life that no longer included him, she realized that the most painful goodbyes are the ones that don't announce themselves. They simply happen, leaving you to face the echo of your own footsteps in a space that no longer feels like home. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like dust after something has been shattered and no one bothers to clean it up. At first, she tried to convince herself that nothing was wrong, that he had just stepped out or that she was overthinking what she felt. But silence has a weight to it, and this one pressed down on her chest with every passing second. It wasn't the comfortable quiet they once shared on late nights, nor the temporary pause after an argument. This silence was intentional, shaped carefully, and meant to be noticed without ever being explained. She sat on the edge of the couch, listening to the house breathe, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside. The ticking clock on the wall all seemed louder now, as if they were filling in for the voice that used to be there. She reached for her phone, then stopped. What would she say if he answered? Or worse, if he didn't? The absence of a message was already a message in itself. He had chosen quiet over confrontation, and that choice spoke louder than any words he could have used. Silence as a way of forcing reflection, and she couldn't escape it. In the past, whenever things became uncomfortable, she filled the space with explanations, justifications, distractions. She believed that talking enough could soften any situation, blur any mistake. But now there was no conversation to control, no narrative to shape. The silence stripped everything down to the truth. It left her alone with her thoughts, replaying moments she once dismissed as minor or harmless. She remembered how often he had gone quiet during disagreements, how she interpreted it as emotional distance or lack of care. She never considered that his silence was his way of processing pain, of choosing restraint over reaction. He had listened more than he spoke, absorbed more than he showed. Each unspoken disappointment had stacked quietly inside him, unseen and unacknowledged. By the time she noticed, the weight had already become too heavy for words. The absence of confrontation felt almost cruel. She had expected anger, a raised voice, accusations she could defend against. Anger would have given her something familiar to respond to, something she understood. Silence gave her nothing. It offered no closure, no clear ending, just a wide-open space where explanations should have been. In that emptiness, she began to realize that his quiet departure wasn't avoidance. It was resolution. She walked to the window and looked out, watching people move on with their lives, unaware that her world had shifted. She wondered how long he had been planning this, how many nights he had sat awake making the decision to leave without leaving scars. The words create. This kind of silence wasn't impulsive. It was the result of someone reaching the point where speaking felt pointless, where being heard no longer mattered as much as being free. Her thoughts drifted to the moments when she had chosen not to listen, when she had brushed off his concerns with a smile or a change of subject. She had believed that as long as he stayed, everything was fine. She didn't understand that staying without being seen can be more painful than leaving. His silence now was the final expression of everything he never said out loud. There was a strange dignity in the way he left. No scenes, no public drama, no attempts to shame or punish her. He didn't try to make her feel small. Instead, he removed himself completely, allowing the truth to surface on its own. The silence forced her to confront her role in the ending without him pointing a finger. It was a mirror she couldn't look away from. As the hours passed, the quiet became unbearable. It echoed with questions she could no longer ask. Did he stop loving her, or did he love himself enough to leave? Had he hoped she would notice sooner, or had he already accepted that she wouldn't? The silence refused to answer. It simply existed, steady and unmoved by her need for reassurance. She finally understood that some people don't leave because they want to hurt you. They leave because staying hurts them more. Silence, in that sense, becomes a form of self-respect. It is the decision to protect one's peace rather than fight for validation. He didn't need her to understand his reasons. He needed space to reclaim himself. The house, once filled with shared noise and half-finished conversations, now held only the consequences of unspoken truths. Every quiet corner reminded her that words lose their power when they come too late. The silence wasn't empty after all. It was full of meaning, heavy with everything that should have been said before it reached this point. And as she sat alone, surrounded by that unyielding quiet, she realized that some endings are not marked by shouting or tears, but by the devastating clarity of silence that says everything without saying a single word. The first thing she noticed wasn't what was missing, but how carefully everything else had been left behind. The couch cushions were straightened, the table wiped clean, the floor free of clutter. It felt staged, not in a dramatic way, but in a deliberate one, like someone wanted the space to remain calm, even as they disappeared from it. As she moved through the rooms, it became clear that this wasn't a rushed escape or an emotional outburst. This was a decision carried out with patience, thought, and an unsettling level of clarity. She opened drawers, not because she expected to find something, but because she needed proof of what her mind was already accepting. His belongings were gone, but only his. Nothing of hers had been disturbed. It was as if an invisible line had been respected to the very end. He hadn't taken things out of spite or carelessness. He had taken only what belonged to him, including the parts of his life he had shared with her. That precision hurt more than chaos ever could. Every removed item felt intentional, like a sentence written without words. The absence of his clothes wasn't just about fabric and hangers. It was about mornings they used to share, routines that quietly built intimacy over time. The missing books from the shelf weren't just objects either. They were late-night conversations, borrowed opinions, moments of connection she barely remembered appreciating. Each empty space carried the weight of something that once mattered more than she allowed herself to admit. She realized then that he hadn't left in anger. Anger is messy, loud, reckless. This departure was controlled, almost respectful. It spoke of someone who had already done their grieving, who had already made peace with the idea of being forgotten. The lack of destruction told her that he didn't want to hurt her. He simply wanted to be gone. That truth sat heavy in her chest, because it meant there was no dramatic mistake to fix, no emotional explosion to calm down. As she stood in the bedroom, staring at the side of the closet that no longer belonged to him, she understood how long this decision must have taken. You don't erase yourself from someone's life overnight. You don't remove every trace without first detaching emotionally. Somewhere along the way, while she believed things were merely complicated, he had already started letting go. He had been present physically while slowly withdrawing everything else. Her mind replayed moments that now looked different through this new lens. His quiet pauses, the way he stopped correcting her, the way he listened without responding. She once thought that meant he didn't care enough to argue. Now she saw the truth. He had stopped fighting because he had stopped hoping. When hope leaves, arguments feel pointless. Silence becomes preparation. There was something almost painful about how complete his exit was. No half-left items, no excuses to return. He hadn't left a charger behind or forgotten a jacket on purpose. There would be no reason for casual contact, no small opening to check in later. He had closed every door gently but firmly. That level of finality made her feel small, not because he wanted her to, but because she realized how replaceable she had allowed herself to become in his inner world. She sat on the bed and tried to remember the last time he seemed truly happy. Not polite, not calm, but genuinely present. The memory felt distant, blurred by all the moments she had taken for granted. She remembered choosing convenience over connection, attention elsewhere, instead of effort at home. At the time, it felt harmless. Standing in that empty room, it felt irreversible. What hurt most was that he hadn't tried to make her understand. He didn't sit her down for a final conversation or demand accountability. He didn't need her acknowledgement anymore. By the time he left, his understanding was complete. He knew who she was in his life, and more importantly, who he had become because of it. Leaving wasn't an act of punishment. It was an act of self-preservation. The absence began to feel louder as the hours passed. Without his presence, she noticed how much emotional labor he had carried quietly. The calm in the house was in peace. It was the echo left behind when someone stops holding everything together. She wondered how many times he had swallowed his feelings just to keep things stable. How often he had chosen harmony over honesty until honesty no longer mattered. She finally understood that removing every trace wasn't about erasing memories. It was about reclaiming identity. He didn't want to be a ghost in her life or a background character in a story that no longer valued him. By leaving completely, he gave himself a chance to exist without shrinking. That realization stung deeply, because it meant that staying with her had required him to become less than he was. As night fell, she accepted that there would be no sudden return, no explanation waiting to arrive. The house would remain exactly as it was, orderly and empty of him, and in that stillness, she faced the truth she had avoided for too long. Sometimes people don't leave because of one mistake or one night. They leave because, over time, they feel themselves disappearing. When they finally go, they don't slam doors or break things. They remove themselves carefully, completely, and without looking back, leaving behind a silence that explains everything words never could. At first, she searched for a reason that would make everything simpler. Something specific she could point to and say, this is where it broke. A single moment, a single mistake, a clear cause that could be isolated and perhaps undone. But as she sat alone in the quiet, she realized there was no single thread to pull. What had happened was the result of many small moments, layered over time, each one dismissed, delayed, or ignored until they formed something irreversible. The dinner was not the beginning. It was the confirmation. She replayed the evening in her mind. The easy laughter, the way she hadn't checked the time. The comfort she felt in being seen and heard without effort. None of it had felt wrong in the moment. She told herself it was harmless, professional, meaningless. But standing in the absence he left behind, she began to understand that meaning isn't always defined by intention. Sometimes it's defined by impact. What felt insignificant to her had landed heavily on him, not because of jealousy, but because it fit into a pattern he already knew too well. He hadn't left because of one dinner or one person. He left because that night reflected something he had been quietly sensing for a long time, the ease with which she gave attention elsewhere. The way her energy shifted when someone new listened, the subtle distance that grew between them while she insisted nothing had changed. That dinner didn't create the fracture. It simply revealed it clearly enough that he could no longer ignore it. As she sat there, she thought about all the times he had tried to reconnect in small, unassuming ways, the conversations he initiated that ended quickly, the plans he suggested that were postponed again and again, the moments when he waited for her presence, only to accept her absence without complaint. Each time, he took her response as information, not as something to argue about. Over time, that information painted a picture he didn't want to see, but couldn't deny. What hurt her most now was realizing how patient he had been. She had mistaken his patience for tolerance, his understanding for endless availability. She believed that as long as he didn't protest, everything was fine. She never considered that silence can also be a form of observation. He was watching, learning, adjusting his expectations quietly while she remained unaware of how far he was drifting away. The dinner symbolized something deeper than suspicion or betrayal. It symbolized choice. Not the choice to be unfaithful, but the choice of where her attention naturally went when she felt It showed him how easily she could prioritize another connection without considering how it might affect him. That realization didn't make him angry. It made him clear. Clarity, unlike anger, doesn't demand confrontation. It demands action. She felt a sharp sting when she understood that he hadn't asked for explanations, because he no longer needed them. Explanations might have softened the moment, but they wouldn't have changed the pattern. He had already seen enough to know that asking her to care more would only delay the inevitable. He didn't want to negotiate for attention or compete for importance in the life of someone who was supposed to choose him naturally. As the night deepened, she confronted the uncomfortable truth that she had grown used to his presence without nurturing it. She relied on the stability he provided while seeking excitement, validation, or understanding elsewhere. It wasn't malicious. It was careless. And carelessness, she now realized, can be just as damaging as intention when repeated often enough. The weight of responsibility settled in slowly, without drama. There was no one else to blame, no villain to point to. He hadn't overreacted. He hadn't misunderstood. He'd simply reached the point where staying meant accepting less than he deserved. Leaving was his way of honoring himself when she no longer did. She thought about how differently things might have unfolded if she had noticed sooner, if she had responded when his efforts were still present. But regret has a way of arriving late, once the door is already closed. The house, calm and orderly, offered no comfort. It only reflected the consequences of choices made without awareness. By the end of the night, she understood that the most painful realizations are not the ones that come with accusations, but the ones that arrive quietly, leaving no room for defense. The dinner wasn't a betrayal in the traditional sense. It was a mirror held up to a truth she hadn't wanted to see. And in that reflection, she finally understood why he left without a word. Why removing every trace was the only way forward for someone who had already tried, waited, and hoped in silence for far too long. The lesson did not arrive as a punishment, nor did it feel like revenge in the way she had always imagined revenge to be. There was no satisfaction in it, no dramatic sense of justice being served. Instead, it arrived quietly, settling into her awareness with a heaviness she couldn't escape. What he left behind wasn't anger or guilt, but understanding. And understanding proved to be far more painful. It forced her to confront herself without resistance, without excuses, without someone else to argue with. She realized that self-respect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it doesn't even look strong from the outside. It looks like restraint. It looks like choosing to walk away instead of demanding to be chosen. He had reached a point where explaining himself felt unnecessary, where protecting his inner peace mattered more than being validated. That realization shook him more than any harsh words ever could. He didn't need her agreement to leave. He needed his own permission, and once he gave it to himself, everything else became irrelevant. As she sat in the quiet, she began to understand how often people confuse endurance with love. He had endured for a long time, absorbing disappointment, lowering expectations, convincing himself that patience was enough. She had benefited from that endurance without recognizing its cost. To her, his consistency felt permanent. To him, it felt exhausting. When endurance is mistaken for obligation, love slowly turns into self-neglect, and he had finally refused to neglect himself any longer. What unsettled her most was the absence of blame. He hadn't tried to make her feel guilty. He hadn't listed her mistakes or demanded accountability. By leaving silently, he placed the responsibility where it belonged, without weaponizing it. That kind of departure carries a strange dignity. It doesn't seek validation or sympathy. It simply states a truth. I will not stay where I am no longer valued. That truth echoed in her mind long after the house went dark. She thought about how Izali people assume that someone will always remain accessible, always willing to wait, always ready to forgive. She had built comfort on that assumption. She hadn't asked herself whether he felt fulfilled, whether his needs were being met, whether his silence was peace or resignation. Only now did she see that his silence had been a warning she chose not to read. The hardest part to accept was that he didn't leave to teach her a lesson, yet she learned one anyway. She learned that attention is not infinite, that presence must be reciprocated, that love cannot survive on habit alone. She learned that when someone stops asking for reassurance, stops seeking connection, stops expressing hurt, it doesn't mean they've stopped caring. It often means they've stopped believing things will change. There was a quiet strength in the way he removed himself completely. By taking every trace, he ensured there would be no lingering attachments, no emotional loose ends to pull him back. He understood that healing requires distance, not nostalgia. Leaving something behind would have meant leaving a piece of himself behind as well, and he had already given enough. That level of clarity comes only after long internal struggle, after accepting truths that are uncomfortable and final. She felt exposed by how clearly his actions reflected her own. His silence highlighted her complacency. His absence emphasized how much she had relied on him without truly showing up in return. She saw now that relationships don't collapse suddenly. They erode quietly, one overlooked moment at a time, until someone finally decides they deserve better than waiting to be noticed. Self-respect, she realized, is not loud. It doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't need explanations. It operates internally, guiding decisions that may look cold from the outside, but are deeply personal. His choice to leave without confrontation wasn't avoidant. It was acceptance. He had accepted that asking for more would not create it, and that staying would only continue the pattern that diminished him. As the hours passed, the lesson settled deeper. She understood that closure is not something another person owes you. Sometimes it is something you are left to find on your own. through reflection rather than conversation. His silence denied her the comfort of resolution, but it gave her the honesty she had avoided. It forced her to sit with the consequences of neglect, not as punishment, but as reality. She thought about how often people underestimate the impact of feeling unseen, not unloved, not betrayed, just unseen. That quiet erosion of importance wears down even the strongest attachment. He hadn't left because he stopped loving her. He left because loving her required him to love himself less, and that was a sacrifice he was no longer willing to make. In that understanding, she felt a shift within herself. Not relief, not forgiveness, but awareness. The kind that lingers, that changes how you move forward. She knew that this lesson would follow her, shaping future choices, reminding her that presence is a responsibility, not a given. That silence can be both an ending and a statement, and that the most powerful form of self-respect is knowing when to walk away without needing to be understood. Sometimes the story does not end with answers. It ends with understanding no arguments were needed. No final words were spoken because the truth had already been lived long before the goodbye. He did not leave to hurt. He left to heal. He did not disappear out of anger. He disappeared out of self-respect. This is what silent heartbreak becomes when it matures, not revenge driven by bitterness, but distance chosen for peace. When someone removes every trace of themselves, they are not erasing love. They are reclaiming dignity. And the lesson is simple, yet heavy. Love cannot survive where attention is borrowed. Presence cannot exist where effort is one-sided. And silence is not emptiness. It is clarity. Some endings are not loud. They do not beg to be noticed. They simply close the door and teach you what should have been valued before it was gone.